Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the beginning of the hearing today on Wednesday, the 21st of August. Our panel today is myself, Keith Hovell, and also Commissioner and Councillor Glenys Dixon. Unfortunately, Cliff Bolger is taken ill and not with us today. So today we are dealing with the residential zones and the Gore West residential development area. The panel members have read the Section 42A report that has come from Joanne Scoos and also some supplementary evidence from her. We have revised plan provisions for the general residential zone, the medium density residential zone, the large lot residential zone, and also for development zones. And I think there's also some changes recommended to the plan in terms of the definitions that are in the plan. So today we'll be starting off with discussions with the Section 42A reporter in terms of queries that we have. Then we have a series of submitters to hear from the rest of the day. So turning to Joanne Scoos and the 42A report and the supplementary evidence, we've read those. Joanne, is there anything else that you need to draw to our attention before questions?
No, if you've read the supplementary evidence, there's nothing further I'd like to add. I note that we received some evidence in yesterday's hearing from Charlton Rise, and also there was some tabled evidence from FENS. I have read through both or all copies of that evidence, and I don't have anything further to add. Thank you.
We've also received some legal advice in terms of the way that the submission from what's headed up Macmillan and Harper is dealt with, and I'll refer to that when they're present with their representative. So that's fine. So I've got a series of questions in terms of just needing to understand some of the detail of what's in the report. And first is, I guess, of a general nature. In terms of the submissions that have come into a number of chapters from New Zealand Rail, there's been recommendations to include some provisions in each of the zone chapters where the rail line is present. I'm just wondering, in the case of the recommendation, in this case on page 35, is to include a new standard S11 in the general residential zone. I've got two issues. One is why not just amend S5, standard 5, because standard 5 requires a 1 metre setback from boundaries, which is the first paragraph of the setback from the rail corridor, and probably isn't needed. So that's the minutiae one, but at a higher level, wouldn't it make more sense just to have one rule sitting in the transport section rather than a whole lot of rules sitting in each of the zone chapters?
So the request from Kiwi Rail was that they had a separate standard for their setback to the rail corridor. I would be more than happy to investigate having one standard within the transport chapter. There could be things to consider in terms of whether or not it would be visible enough in the transport chapter as opposed to the zones. But given that we've got sort of notes that advise plan users that whilst the zone chapters apply, so do the district-wide, and therefore it's prudent for them to review those district-wide chapters, it could sit within that chapter quite comfortably. I guess the other thing to consider is just whether or not, if the standards are slightly different depending on the zones, that would just need to be detailed in that standard as well.
And I think what reinforces this is that there's setbacks in the transport chapter from the state highways. And I think one of the things I got out of the hearing yesterday, out of the report and also out of your report, is referring to the state highway as the state highway, not an interregional connector route or whatever we've got. I think the simple English is the clearer way to go.
Yes, I believe the NZTA brought out I think they call it their One Roads, which may have been where that interconnector road has come from.
Yeah.
So we probably just need to be consistent, or we need to be consistent across the plan, but probably refer to the most up-to-date standard that's been utilised.
Your paragraph 71, I kind of took a deep breath when I first read it, because the way it's worded implied that that additional rule that you've got above it should go into each of the dozen or so standards that you've referred to there. I realised after a brief moment that in fact it's reference to that rule that should go into those other standards.
Sorry, which page number is this?
On your paragraph 71, page 36.
171.
Oh, sorry, 171. I've got it covered up partly.
Oh, I see. Yes, no, it's just the reference, where we've got those permitted conditions and reference to the standards, just insertion in those rules.
Your paragraph 195 on page 43. So it's recommended that there's a new policy relating to services that says where articulated services aren't available, require activities to be self-sufficient and ensure appropriate on-site service provision is provided having regard to. Is that duplicating what's in the Building Act?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't consider it as. There are environmental effects that can be attributed to on-site servicing, and whilst the Building Act will look at certain aspects in terms of making sure the systems work, I do think that there is environmental effects that can be considered. With these zones where we've got the potential for non-reticulated services, it is important that we consider how the residential units are designed on site so that we can accommodate services appropriately.
Some subdivisions that take place, particularly in areas like Queenstown, the whole subdivision is served by a private scheme, whereas the policy just says that require activities to be self-sufficient. So does that rule out the community type facilities?
No, I don't believe so. When we get to the subdivision hearing, there's more discussion around servicing provision and those community type possibilities come into play. So the intention is not for that policy to remove the ability to have a community focused servicing provision.
Okay, so on the bottom of that page, section 671, the large lot residential, deals with the properties in Waimea Street. And so your recommendation is that half of that, and there's an updated plan, I can't see it in my papers here, so that half of that land becomes large lot residential, is it, or? General residential. So the tavern that fronts the state highway, you're recommending remains large lot residential?
Yes, so the submission that came in for this area of land requested that the tavern and motel be rezoned or revert back to its rural zoning, which I've explained that I don't think that's appropriate given the level of development on the site. The However, given that the site is already developed, I didn't see the benefit of upzoning it to general residential, given it's not residential in nature and it's already well developed.
Is it a relevant fact? Well, presumably changing the zoning from rural to large lot residential for the tavern will change its value?
Potentially, yes. It's probably outside of my expertise.
Under Section 32 is the economic impact of changing the value of the land and the impact on rating for that particular business a relevant factor?
We do have to look at a cost-benefit analysis, and that would include, it could include the rating as such. I think, though, what's more important is whether zoning is reflective of that current land use. And the rating in this district, whilst it used to be based on urban versus rural, has now moved to a land-based rating approach. So it's actually the use of the land is reflected in the rating rather than just whether or not it's rural or urban, which is a more equitable approach, in my opinion.
Okay. To paragraph 218 and page 46, your figure 5 shows a green area. What is the green area?
The colours are slightly warped with the printing. Okay, let me just double check this. Oh, okay. So yes, sorry, I'm just reminding myself of this rezoning request. Mm-hmm. So we did deal with this in hearing stream 3. The green area is the area of land that the submitter requested be upzoned. Mm-hmm. And then the blue area is that submitter's particular site. So they requested land sort of beyond their own site to be rezoned. And as part of hearing stream 3, if my memory serves, I had reviewed the entirety of the land and decided that the area to the east was more appropriate for residential, or more dense residential development due to its topography, whereas the area to the west is actually very undulated and it's quite a steep hillside.
So when you talk about east-west, so the boundary road runs east-west?
Yes, so sorry, when I talk about east-west, I mean to the east of that submitter's land, which is the area shaded blue, yes, like the square, and then west, I mean the area closer towards
right.
Hamilton Street that leads into...
So does that submission then open or bring into scope the possibility, if the panel is of a mind, to rezone the entire area of green to something other than rural lifestyle?
Yes. Yeah, there is scope to rezone that entire
right.
area. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Paragraph 221 will relate to the Clark Fortune McDonald Associates submission that talks about rationalising zone boundaries so that they follow cadastral boundaries. Mm-hmm. And the pattern or the approach that has been used to date in terms of determining zone boundaries is taking into account the high-class soils in some cases, and in other cases the flood-prone areas. Were there any other factors that determined the zone boundaries?
If I'm considering the rezoning or the reviews that I have undertaken in terms of the district plan, in cases there were areas of land that we have upzoned based on the existing land use. So we've tried to ground truth where possible to give people zoning that is reflective of the activity they're undertaking. A good example of this is down in Mataula, alongside the state highway. There's a strip of residential houses which were existing and currently zoned rural. So I have proposed a large lot residential zoning over those houses, which has meant that they are split zoned because a lot of the lots sort of run, they're quite long in length and then have kind of paddocks at the back. So whilst it wasn't appropriate to upzone the entirety of that land, given there was constraints and, for instance, flooding, in terms of actually providing those property owners with usable rules, I deemed it appropriate to upzone them to large lot residential. And the way that the zonings work in that respect when they do technically split zone a site is that activities undertaken in that large lot area would just be assessed against those large lot rules. And if they were to undertake an activity at the rear of their site, which is rural, then those rules would apply. So it almost has two sites in a way. But it just means that if somebody wanted to do extensions or build residential units or amend things, then they would be looking at setback rules, coverage rules, etc., that are reflective of the fact that they've got a residential unit, and because otherwise you'd sort of end up with these obscure setbacks that are never going to work for them. So that is an instance where the sites are split zoned, and they've been split zoned on a basis of their existing land use rather than a restraint such as highly productive soil or flooding.
Right. So in the case of the ones that have got split zoning, setbacks are required from the zone boundary on their own lot?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. Is it open, is there scope in the case of those properties, and using the Mataura ones as an example, to give an exemption to the setback from the boundary, from the zone boundary, because it's on the same lot? Because theoretically they could give themselves written approval to be built to the boundary of the zone, well within their own existing legal title. So my question is there scope in the submission to actually make it more usable for the landowners?
Yes, I consider there is scope on the basis that we've received the submission from Clark Fortune around cadastral boundaries and zoning and usability. So I think the scope, there is scope in that aspect. And also there was another submission, which I believe was considered in the rural hearing stream, which talked about specifically those Mataura sites and just the usability of the split zoning. So I do consider there is scope to look at the usability of that. I understand that it is not the most straightforward approach, and ideally we would like to follow cadastral boundaries, but that, in my opinion, we can't always do that.
Right, and there may well be a need for the, I guess if the panel actually sees other examples similar to Mataura, we'll come back and seek some clarification by way of a minute. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Can I just ask a question? How big are the lots? Like, can they actually have another building on the lot, or is there quite a lot of land behind those homes?
In the Mataura?
In the Mataura, just in that instance.
Yeah, so I'd have to double check exactly the lot size. The density in the large lot residential zone is 2,000 metres squared. And my understanding is those lots along the highway are probably around that size. But then also you could do development on the rear of the lot. But it would need to, specifically in that Mataura area, we'd need to consider that flood hazard.
Now, over on page 49 is the Mataura buffer area. and there's no submissions to it, but you're suggesting that for consistency, given your recommendation for the East Gore one, that the buffer area should come off there as well.
I'm pretty sure that there is submissions for both.
Okay.
I can double check and highlight to you the ones that specifically talk about the Mataura ones, but I'm pretty confident that they refer to both.
If you can check that and come back, that would be good. Page 57, paragraph 270. So this is recommending, in addition to policy, general residential policy 9, to avoid activities that are incompatible with the character, qualities and purpose of the general residential zone, except where the activity is critical infrastructure. It seems to me that the addition you've made may actually read better in a positive way as a separate policy. So you've got a general then tacks on to it one particular activity. Why not other activities?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then that enables, I guess, a positive policy that says to provide for critical infrastructure, and given the legal principle of the specifics override the general. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's certainly a relationship between these zone-specific chapters and then the general district-wide chapters such as infrastructure, that I think when we get to the infrastructure hearing will help align some of these policies. So whilst in the infrastructure chapter we've got some positive enabling policies for infrastructure, we have had a lot of submissions from infrastructure companies concerned about this avoid policy. For instance, GRZ P9. This particular policy is in relation to the catch-all rule, so we're just ensuring that we don't have incompatible activities in these zone-specific chapters. I understand the approach that you're suggesting, and I think there could be some further consideration around how best to address the concerns of the infrastructure companies versus maintaining the integrity of this policy. And I understand in terms of if we start providing exemptions for one activity, do we need to be more specific with others? I consider that the policy suite as a whole in these residential chapters is prescriptive in the activities that it is intending to provide for, and where it is silent on activities, it's envisaged that this policy would apply. So in this instance, my addition is to highlight that whilst this policy is there to avoid incompatible activities, I have made an exemption for that critical infrastructure because it is important in terms of the urban environment and functioning of it.
So if it is important, then it's compatible, probably. But your response has actually foreshadowed my next question, because if you've got a policy in this chapter, you probably need it in the other residential zone ones as well. And maybe the simplest approach is in the infrastructure chapter. So the key issue that we're going to have in the infrastructure chapter is it a standalone chapter? that overrides the spatial or the zone chapters. And until we've had that, I guess we can't resolve these types of things. In the same way that until we've had the natural hazards hearing, we can't resolve a number of the submissions that have come in from Environment Southland that are to the individual zones as well. And it's just unfortunate that those hearings are, or the natural hazards one is a long way through the process rather than at the beginning.
Yeah, I guess similarly though, having these first, we're sort of rooting out these issues and problems that we can then make sure we cover off in those later zones, chapters.
Okay, over to page 61. At the top of the page, there's a new standard for the general residential, referring to activity status for where it's not achieved. So what I've written here is rule GRZ R1, non-compliance with rule R1 is non-complying, yet when we get here it says that non-compliance is discretionary. So there needs some, the way that it integrates with rule 1 in this chapter needs to be refreshed.
Yeah, just give me a moment, I'll just have a quick look.
Take your time.
So this, the standard has been amended to allow for more of a sliding scale on that density approach. And part of the reasoning for that is a lot of our general residential areas existing, and we will be most likely dealing with infill development, and infill development has its positives in terms of compact urban form. So the submission came in from Clark Fortune around the lot size and how we could manage instances where we've got sort of minor non-compliances. So in relation to GRZ R1 though, yes, okay. So GRZ R1, one of the permitted conditions is that they need to comply with the density. So we may need a bit of rewording in relation to that point.
That's right. So on the right-hand side, it says not non-compliance with that density rule is non-complying. Yet in the standard, it says it's discretionary. Yeah,
so we might just need to. Are you happy for me to take that away and provide you with some amended wording?
The thought occurred to me that, in fact, if you added to the permitted activity rule and actually dealt with it there, might be an easier way. But I'll
I see what you mean. Yeah, I'll consider that. Yep.
Yeah. Right, over on page 63, is servicing and potable water. And you've done what seems to be something nice and simple to resolve what we've been struggling with in terms of taking out reference to the 45,000 litres and just requiring provision to be made for potable water on a site. How do you envisage firefighting water then being provided for?
Mm-hmm. So I've reviewed the evidence from FENS, and I consider respectfully through the 42A reports, we were encouraging the submitter to provide a more usable standard for firefighting that we could then incorporate into our servicing provision. I consider we're not in a position where we've got that workable standard, and therefore we have highlighted that whilst it's not been proposed to be within the RMA, we do have the subdivision and development bylaw. There is parts of the Building Act that consider it, but not entirely, which I accept and agree with. So we could make amendments for this servicing standard, even where it says provide potable water. We could reference potable water and firefighting, and therefore, whilst we're not identifying an explicit standard that they need to meet, we are suggesting that our expectation is that they're providing potable water for drinking and also water for firefighting. That may be a way that we're sort of highlighting that when we say requirement for water, we also mean firefighting. But in lieu of not having a more workable standard from FENS, I am hesitant to have it in the plan.
I noted that Admore Designs said they wanted it reduced from 45,000 litres to 44,000 litres. I just wondered what that was all about as well. It seems...
Yeah, I think it's to do with the size of the tanks, and their submission was helpful in that it was putting forward that 45,000 litres it's the kind of typical standard for FENS, but actually there are other situations where you don't need that much.
Yes.
Smaller houses, you don't need 45,000 litres. If you've got a sprinkler system, you don't need 45,000 litres. If you've got a swimming pool, you don't need 45,000 litres in a tank. So, yeah, that submission was helpful to highlight that the 45,000 litres was problematic in terms of it was too specific, because there's multiple situations that we might find ourselves in. But I still agree that there is positives to having a firefighting standard, or at least a servicing standard that references it, similar to having standard for wastewater and stormwater. So whether or not it's as simple as inputting the word firefighting into that point C might be a way forward, or we've still got a few hearings to go, so we might get something from FENS.
My initial response on seeing a submission that said drop from 45 to 44 was that it was a typo error and the submission had been summarised incorrectly. So I went back to the original submission and printed it off. And you're right, there is a nice description that says that, you know, if you're in a house under 200 square metres, then for your domestic use you need a 20,000 litre tank. If you've got a bigger house, notwithstanding people like me have got a bigger house with one person in it, that says that you need 32,000 litres for normal use, and with firefighting on top of that. So I think the Council Subdivision and Development Bylaw has some provisions in it that I guess as an external document is able to be referred to and looking at the way that the standard is administered. And unless we hear something, I guess, that gives us more guidance from FENS, that's probably the best that we're able to do.
I think the Building Act has suggestions like what, but it's not mandatory. I think that's how it works. But yeah, FENS should actually provide some more information, I feel, about what they expect, what their expectations are.
Your paragraph 322 relates to the changing of the length of a building adjacent to a property boundary, and you've recommended from 6 metres up to 8 metres, and Clark Fortune McDonald in their submission set out a logical reason for that you've accepted. But you go on to say in that the setback rule itself, or changes to it, is in other zones, but there may not be clear scope to flow this through to other zones, and that it may be permissible. You've got clause 10, but it's clause 16 of the first schedule. Is it the change in number or the additional bit below that you're talking about?
So this is in relation to accessory buildings and exemptions. So we've got that rule, obviously it's most prominent and utilised in the residential zone, but it is also present in the mixed use zone and potentially others. So I just wanted to highlight at this point that I'd agreed with the submission in this case, and I think it has merit, but the submission didn't refer to those other chapters. However, it could be that as a consequential change, it's appropriate to amend it in the other chapters. I'll just check, because I know there's section 16, which is our minor errors, but I think there might be recourse for you to make amendments as consequential changes.
Okay. Because there's probably another, we've got a list of a few others where if we're able to do that would be helpful.
Yes. Yeah, so clause 10.2b under Schedule 1 of the RMA, the decision may include matters relating to any consequential alterations necessary to the proposed statement or plan arising from the submissions, and then any other matter relevant to the proposed statement or plan.
Okay, so it is
So
clause.
I do think there's a recourse there for you to consider making similar changes to other zones, even though there might not be a direct submission.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. To paragraph 334 on page 67. So MOE support but seek an amendment to the word enable instead of only allow. Now, we were reminded yesterday of the Wellington City guidelines in terms of if you've got a permitted activity, then enable is a good word to use. Let me just bring up the policy for, so this is medium residential, medium density. So I guess going through it step by step, the policy refers to community facilities, healthcare and educational facilities, and what is the status of those and emergency service.
I think they are restricted discretionary. There is a controlled activity for additions to existing healthcare and educational facilities, and the policy 7 is applicable to those. And then for our restricted discretionary activities, we've got policy 8, which talks about only allow. So yes, in my assessment, I've acknowledged that enable is potentially, is used more frequently when we're permitting an activity, and given that these activities have got restricted discretionary activity status.
Yeah, my concern, I guess, is that as worded, it's almost a rule that you're required to avoid adverse effects, so there's no allowance for adverse effects that are, I guess, less than minor or anything else. So rather than enable, if they're controlled and discretionary, would provide for be a better terminology.
Yes, provide for may be more suitable. And then potentially that point 1, if you're concerned about the use of avoid and not inclusion of mitigate, manage, then that could be amended as well.
Rather than avoid, remedy or mitigate adverse effects.
Yeah. Avoid, remedy, mitigate.
Paragraph 347. I guess to be polite, the word I wrote beside it was, with the way that it reads, is yuck. And again, this may be a case where you've got it may be better to actually split it into two policies. Ensure development does not comprise, including infrastructure, or will be appropriately upgraded where practicable. And it's all these,
Yeah, I understand what you're saying here. I think this policy is reflective of the current state of affairs in terms of infrastructure, and obviously trying to strike a balance of a forward-thinking plan in terms of enabling development and having appropriate policy structure in place to manage the effects of that development. So this policy is trying its best to require either demonstration that there is existing infrastructure to support development, and if there is not, then there is an expectation that infrastructure will be upgraded to enable such development. But I agree that it is slightly too wordy. But that is the intent of the policy. It's reflective of the existing situation that we're in, and obviously we are writing policies and rules for a forward-thinking plan, so we can't be restricted based on our current situation, but we need to acknowledge that infrastructure is a big part of development, and we need to manage it appropriately. And I've just seen we've got the word infrastructure twice.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And when you're writing a report that's 105 pages long, we're very understanding that you tend to be focused on what's in front of you and not thinking a bit wider.
Yeah.
So we will be coming back asking that you actually have another look at this in terms of something that's easier to read, but also when it comes to administering the policy and considering consents, something that the consent planners are able to, I guess, understand fully what has been asked for.
Yeah, noted.
Yeah, maybe that's the simple. And believe it or not, there's a similar one on page 82 where I wrote the same comment. So this is similar to what came up before. This is the large lot residential, talking about incompatible activities except for critical infrastructure. So again, until we've had the infrastructure hearing, how we deal with that policy, we'll have to wait. So in large lot residential S9 on page 86, let's just bring it up. I gave the example yesterday when I was in Vancouver. I spent some time looking at car parks and the way that they design their car parks with certain types of bricks, and the water just runs down off the surface, it's not channeled. And in cases where it does flow, then there's strips between the parking. Instead of being bumper to bumper, there's strips provided so that it can disappear. So when I was reading Nigel Calburn's submission, that came back to me. So I guess with Standard 9, my question is, what is the purpose of the standard?
So the standard discusses permeability, and it has two, I guess, functions. One being stormwater management, by ensuring that we don't have unnecessary amounts of hard surfacing, and also hand in hand with that, having lesser hard surfacing means more open space or opportunities for landscaping, which increases amenity in an area. So whilst I appreciate the submitter's intentions and intentions in terms of stormwater and looking at alternative ways of managing this, I didn't want the standard to be so prescriptive that it was just relating to asphalt or permeable means of hard surfacing, because whilst there is an element of stormwater management in that standard, it's also around amenity and sort of larger areas of open space and green space in that zone. I think there is definitely a place for alternative stormwater management means, and I think we can explore that through the likes of the development bylaw or in terms of communal spaces and things. I think we need to be a little bit careful around requiring those types of driveways or areas on private property, just because they can be a bit more expensive. And yeah, so the permeable surface rule, whilst is there to manage stormwater, it's also around landscaping and open space to achieve amenity in the zone.
There's no landscaping provision for this zone, is there?
For the large lot zone,
No. Yes.
it's just this permeability
Right.
percentage.
Is there some way that we could consider permeable areas? Do you have a suggestion that we could
Yeah,
include
so
that?
standard 9 in the large lot zone requires that at least 30% of the net site area shall comprise landscape permeable area, which is basically making sure that we've got grassed areas or areas of planting to assist with both stormwater management and amenity.
And the subdivision development bylaw has provisions in it encouraging green infrastructure. Now, Transpower on paragraph 451 would like to see the yard that they've got up on Ruby Road excluded from the outline development plan. And what was your view on that?
Okay. Yeah, so if we have a look at the outline development plan,
Page 89.
page 89. So Transpower have got that electricity substation, which is just off Ruby Road. So that is proposed to be designated under the district plan. So in terms of their use of that area, I think that it is, actually if you go to page 90, it shows it a little bit better. So the little blue box, that's the designated area for Transpower's substation. So they'll manage that area of land via their designation. I think their submission was also discussing the National Grid corridor that runs up Terry Road, and they did not want this area to be included in the outline development plan. In my assessment, I think I do discuss that whilst it is within the outline development plan, obviously the rules of the infrastructure chapter around development in that National Grid corridor will apply, and that has setbacks in terms of building platforms and general development. So I don't think it's necessary to exclude that area from the outline development plan, because we've still got additional rules in place to manage development in that area. It's not giving free rein for that developer, for that area to be developed.
Okay, what the representative of the development group up there said yesterday was that there's no harm in the substation being removed. The dashed line actually going around the edge of the power thing, the underlying zoning, which is the yellow, which is the residential, is able to stay. It just means making it clear that the area to be developed does not include the substation.
Yeah, equally, yeah, I have no problem with removing that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Back to the plan on page 89. The green areas shown show as reserve. Is it intended that be a council reserve?
Yes, so it's likely to be a local purpose reserve or a dual purpose reserve for the management of stormwater. So I guess to give you some background, so the development of this area in terms of the district plan and why it is a development area is obviously given that it's a large site, and we wanted to make sure we had a comprehensive approach to how it would be developed. So the landowner provided expert reports in relation to stormwater management, wastewater management, looking at the existing infrastructure that we've got and what upgrades would be required to facilitate the development. And through that, we reviewed the topography of the site and how stormwater would need to be managed. So there was an integrated approach in terms of the landowner and the Three Waters department at council in terms of these reserve areas, identifying land that would be required in order to manage the stormwater.
So if we go to the your appendix 2, which I think is the updated provisions for the chapter for development area 2, just I guess just a layout question first. On page 14, you've got numbers 7 and 8. I'm assuming they should be 1 and 2, and the 9, 10 on the next page, and 11, 12, 12A should all be starting again as 1s and 2s. Is there any reason?
Yeah. So they are correct. It's just I understand they are a little bit
Confusing.
Yeah, they are confusing. They relate to this activity occurring in the different zones. So because we've got a development area that's got multiple zones within it, and not only multiple zones, but a few hazard areas as well, it's basically directing how development, new building structures, earthworks, and land disturbance can occur in each of these zones. And then the reason that the numbers follow on is that they then relate to if you breach, hold on, I was thinking about this the other day.
Because it starts at 7, and I'm going back to look at development area 1 to see if that finishes at 6, and it doesn't.
Do you mean on the right-hand side where it's talking about?
Yeah.
So if you breach DVR to 1. Okay. Yeah, so basically what that means is that if you're going to build in the residential zone, for instance, and you don't have a subdivision or a land use consent, then you're a restricted discretionary activity where you are in accordance with the outline development plan and where you comply with the standards. Now, if you are not in accordance with the development plan and you don't comply with the standards, then you're breaching, then you become discretionary because you're breaching DV 2, R2, 7 or 8, which is just below it. And then equally, if you're just breaching, so if you do have a resource consent or a subdivision, but then you're breaching a zone chapter rule, then you're...
Wait, you're losing me.
Yeah, I know.
Help. Rule 2 relates to new
Yeah.
building structures, earthworks, land. And you're permitted where the building is in accordance with a subdivision or land use consent and the relevant zone chapter standards. So if you don't meet rule number 1, which is you don't have a consent, then number 7 applies. Why is it
Yes.
numbered 7?
Because if you continue down the left-hand column, you go through the general residential zone medium, and then you get to rural lifestyle, which is point 3 and 4. And then you keep going down and you get to, that's hazard area 1. And then you keep going down to hazard area 2, which is your 5 and your 6. And then you move up to 7 on the right-hand side. So it's almost a crescendo of the rules going through the zones.
Is that what has happened in the other development zone as well?
I'd have to check.
Please. But presumably all the numbers will change anyway because you've got a 6A and a 12A and things like that.
Yeah, so we have based
Okay.
on the submission of Charlton Rise, we have included things. It may be that it might be easier to split the rules out depending on the zones. I guess the way that these development chapters work, that they are a roadmap of developing the area, and then in my mind we need to make it almost as if the chapter falls away once it's been developed and the zones take up precedent, but it's just functioning, making sure we've got rules to enable that to happen. I guess the other thing to consider is that we envisage that this area will be developed comprehensively and it'll have stage subdivision bit by bit, but without, obviously we need to account for worst case scenario and that land could be subdivided and sold, and so on that basis that's why we've got these rules sort of requiring development to be in accordance with resource consents and land use consents so that we can manage it as best we can,
Right.
without being overly controlling of the development.
Okay. So the Dev 2 Rule 2, new buildings permitted where, then we go to the next page and so that first bit on page 14 applies to areas except hazard area 1 and hazard area 2. So on the next page we've got rural lifestyle zone within hazard area 1, okay, which is above the road line. I'm just wondering, thinking about when someone like the consents planner at council is actually referring to these provisions, whether in fact we shouldn't be putting an A or B or something else in that helps differentiate them.
Yeah, I think re-looking at this, and on the basis that we've adding in additional kind of standards, for example, 4A and 6A, I think it would be preferable to split out the hazard areas 1 and 2 and actually have them as separate rules. So DV2, R3 and R4. And then we can be really clear about the corresponding activity statuses and
I like that idea.
yeah, I can provide you
Yeah,
something
yeah,
if you'd like.
Yeah, that's the third thing. So on page 16, and I'll wait for you to write that down. Yep. Yep. Just wait for it to stop writing. Okay. Right.
Joe, I'm just not sure, but in checking, I'm looking now at DEV2R1 in the rural lifestyle zone, and when it in C, building used to house or feed, and it's got milk stock, but in the rural lifestyle zone, it also covers just animals, stock of any kind. Is there any reason why there is that?
Differentiation. No, I'd have to go back and check to make sure I didn't make any amendments in that rural hearing that needed to flow through into this. The rural lifestyle zoning of this area was intentional to take into account that there is areas of that land that is not appropriate to be developed due to the mining hazard. So we needed to make sure that that land could be managed and utilised. So that was the reason for having a rural lifestyle zone in that area. But also we needed to recognise that it's anticipated that there will be a high density sort of urban development around it. So we needed to make sure we didn't have activities that were going to cause nuisance effects as well. But I'll have a look at that point C in terms of buildings used to house.
Yeah,
or
I think
feed.
the GRUZ S4 one is buildings that house animals are set back 50 metres.
Yes, so in that rural lifestyle zone, those setback rules will apply, given that's rural lifestyle. So they'll apply in addition to that rule. So that rule, Dev 2 R1, is just to enable those agricultural type activities to manage the land, but you would still need to comply with the rural lifestyle rules for setbacks of buildings
Setbacks as
that
well.
house animals, yeah.
So by specifying milk animals, would leave out any other like horses or
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's specifically restricting, so you couldn't have
dairy
buildings.
cows.
Yeah.
On the bottom of page 16, you've got a new 6A. So going to the heading above, new building structures, earthworks and land disturbances permitted, so it is permitted where the site is not identified as being at risk from historic mining hazards or the risk has been mitigated. Who is going to identify and where?
So the premise of this development area and the work that has been done up to this point has included geotechnical investigation. Now, the geotechnical investigation identified these two hazard areas based on the existing or historic mining activity that has been undertaken. And the conclusions of the geotech report was that further analysis needs to be done in relation to these two areas before development can proceed. So ideally, and how I envisage the land being developed, is that further geotech investigation would be undertaken, which would then identify exact locations of hazard and would also then identify areas free from hazard. So these additional 4A and 6A are there as a belts and braces type approach, so that if someone was to develop or wish to develop having not done this additional investigation, then they wouldn't fall into that permitted activity because they cannot identify where or not the hazards are.
Okay, the structure and the negative is what gets me. Now, where the word not is located, I guess. So you're saying it's permitted provided that it's not at risk of hasn't been identified. Yeah. Okay, the site is not so it's permitted if the site is not identified. Well, I haven't done the work, so it's not identified. So you almost need something along the lines of shown not to be.
Yeah, demonstrated not to be.
Yes.
Yeah, the policies, like the policy structure, I consider is really clear in terms of the expectations of how it should be developed and hazards identified or not, and how those hazards need to be identified. So I can look at how we can incorporate, or even I'll look at the wording of the policy, specifically policy 3 and policy 5, particularly policy 5, and how we can potentially incorporate some of that wording into the rule, because that's really clear in terms of our expectations of managing these hazard areas.
Well, and also your new policy 6 you've recommended on page 12, because it says avoid land use within sites that are identified until further investigations have been completed, I wrote, by who and when.
Well, by who and when? So it's likely that these, the hazard investigation will be done as part of a subdivision, and your expectation would be that it would be a suitably qualified person. Because if you were subdividing, you'd still need to get through section 106 of the RMA, which is looking at hazards. But just in general, if you were doing a subdivision, you need to be looking at geotech.
So can that be made a little bit more focused then in that? The other issue I had with the policy was that you're not allowed to use it for agriculture until that work's been done as well, because it says any land use, avoid land use. So agriculture is a land use, so you're not allowed to use the land for agriculture until the work's been done. I guess what you're wanting to avoid in policy 6 is further development.
Yes, well, yeah, because you'd be permitted under R1, so that policy wouldn't sort of kick in. But I understand, yeah, further land use would be a better word.
And if we go back to page 16 on the right-hand side, the discretionary, the methods there. So it's discretionary where, so on the permitted column, you've got it's permitted where it hasn't been identified, and if it doesn't comply with that, it becomes discretionary, but the same standard is in the discretionary side of it.
Yeah, so if you are non-compliant with if you haven't got a subdivision or land use, but you are in accordance with the outline development plan, but you still haven't identified whether or not you're subject to hazards, then you drop down and you're non-complying.
But 6A is a separate standard, and you've got the word, 6A is a separate standard, there is no and after 6 that links it to 5.
So if you breach 5, like if you don't have a land use or a subdivision,
And you're non-compliant. And you go down to R2.
Yes, if you breach 6A, you're non-complying. So if you try and develop in those areas and you don't have a geotech,
So where's the shortcut that tells me if you breach 6A, you're non-complying?
right at the bottom of page 17.
Ah, okay. Thank you. That answers that one.
Yeah, sorry. But I think if I split them out, and re-put them, if I put them in their own rules,
Yes.
look at the numbers,
Yes,
I think I
please.
can tidy it up nicely.
Yeah. The staff at council, I think, would appreciate that greatly. Okay, well, all that was on, arose from page 89 of what's in your report. You didn't deal with, we're just dealing with development area 2, aren't we, not 1?
Yes, correct.
Lucky you. Over on page 99. So I guess you're adding something to the rule here for those people that don't understand the subdivision process, by way of the notes underneath. But I'm wondering whether in fact that is the right place for the first note, whether that shouldn't be in the glossary somewhere. It's going to be included as a note on any subdivision consent, so why does it need to be added here as well? I know you're trying to be helpful, but I don't really see what's gained by having it here.
There is an element of plan usability there. Obviously, this development area, it's a large area of land, and it's envisaged that it'll be developed in a staged manner. And I think it was important to make sure that it was really clear that whilst the land is being developed bit by bit, the remainder of it can still be utilised and managed through agricultural means. Yeah. So whilst I would read that and be clear on the land's undeveloped, it can be farmed, the submitter raised issues with that in terms of whether or not it was, how clear it was. And if, I think their concern, which I understand, was at what point do you call something undeveloped or not? If there's a shed on it, has it been developed and therefore it can't then be farmed? So it was more about highlighting that when we're talking about undeveloped, we mean, is there a sort of comprehensive land use or subdivision that has not been implemented at this point?
Wondering, the first bit that you said about it's expected that there'll be an initial overall, I guess, approach to development, but it'll almost happen in stages. Whether that's something that might helpfully be put at the text at the beginning, which is on page 10.
Yes, because I think we talk about how we anticipate the site to be developed comprehensively, and we can probably add something in there around it being staged.
Yes. Because I read what was there of, wow, the whole lot was going to happen all at once, which I thought wouldn't be realistic.
No, we did consider looking at staging and having staging in the plan, but there's so many possibilities, I think, when you develop land, of what may eventuate and how, even directed by the market. So I do think you need to be cautious around the control that a district plan has on these bigger greenfield developments, because it might be that, you know, larger lots need to come first in order to get funding for later lots, or could be dependent on servicing and what can be upgraded first. So I was just cautious to put a staging plan in the district plan, because who knows what might happen.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important that that's recognised.
Okay. We've used up the allotted time to talk to you this morning, and I think we've used it very productively, and that's all the questions I've got.
Wonderful.
So I propose that we take a 10-minute break until the submitters are due. It says 11:30.
They are, they're waiting online though, apparently, so.
Okay. And
Right.
it says here in person on the list.
No, that's what I was told.
Oh, okay. So can you bring them up online? Because, it's worth asking them. And I guess if people are waiting online, there's no reason why they can't come in
Well,
and put on mute.
they are in and on mute,
Right.
but Brett left, so I'm just gonna email him asking if we can jump back on.
Okay, so if they can hear me now, we'll bring them up and we can have a chat to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Who's online?
Brett.
Okay.
Giddens.
All right.
Okay, so it appears that he's not at his computer if it's not responding. We'll adjourn then. Can you just email him and say, is he going to be online and the people coming in at 11:30, in which case we'll adjourn to 11:30. If there's any change from that, let us know.
Well, good morning.
Good morning, Brett. Keith Ovell here. Just checking that I guess we'll be talking to you online. Are the property owners coming in person?
Yeah, that's right, Keith. I'm pretty much free when you guys are. So if you want to take your adjournment, I'm happy to jump back on 10 minutes if that suits you.
Yeah, well, if they're coming in, they're not due here till 11:30.
I think they are coming in at 11 o'clock. I did see an email from Lindsay a little bit earlier.
Okay.
So I passed that on to them to come back a little bit earlier.
Right. All right. So we'll adjourn until they arrive, and then talk to you then.
Right. Thanks a
Cheers.
lot.
Right.